It was a silent morning in March, 44 BC. The sky above Rome hung heavy beneath layers of gray, as if the city itself sensed something shifting beneath the surface. Merchants opened their stalls, soldiers walked their routes, and senators prepared for another ordinary day, unaware that within a few hours, a single moment would fracture the future and transform Rome forever. History did not arrive with thunder that morning. It moved quietly, hidden inside decisions already made, waiting for the right door to close behind it. Long before Rome became marble and legend, before emperors and golden statues and stories whispered across centuries, there was a morning when the air felt wrong, as if the city itself was holding its breath without knowing why. And on that morning, Julius Caesar walked toward the Senate with the confidence of a man who believed the future had already chosen him, while unseen currents gathered beneath every step he took. Currents made not of wind or weather, but of fear, ambition, and ideas too large for any single person to control. And those waiting inside the Senate were not merely politicians, but men wrestling with their own reflections. Men who believed themselves defenders of something ancient and fragile. The Republic, a word that meant power shared, yet was constantly shaped by those strong enough to claim it. And among them stood Brutus, whose thoughts moved like quiet storms beneath calm eyes, and Cassius, whose mind rarely trusted appearances, and dozens of others whose names history remembers only faintly, shadows attached to one moment that would outlive their entire lives. And when Caesar entered that chamber, he carried with him victories, reforms, and the loyalty of the masses, but also the suspicion of elites who feared that one man's strength could erase centuries of tradition. And so the moment unfolded not as chaos, but as inevitability, a convergence of decisions already made in private conversations, silent nods, and sleepless nights, and after it was done, the conspirators expected relief, perhaps applause, perhaps the feeling that history had confirmed their courage. But instead, they faced silence so heavy it felt like judgment, and Rome, unpredictable and vast, did not react as they had imagined, because the crowd outside did not see tyrant and saviors but loss and confusion. And in that gap between intention and perception, the fate of the conspirators was sealed, though none of them understood it yet. And as news spread through narrow streets and across crowded markets, Caesar transformed instantly from political figure into symbol. And symbols are dangerous because they belong to everyone at once, reshaped by emotion rather than argument. And when Mark Antony stood before the people and spoke not with fury, but with careful reminders of generosity and shared victories, the atmosphere shifted like clouds moving across sunlight, and whispers began to turn against those who claimed to have saved the Republic, and Brutus felt the ground change beneath him, not physically, but emotionally, as allies hesitated and conversations cooled, and he told himself that truth required patience, that Rome would eventually recognize the necessity of their actions. Yet deep inside uncertainty grew, and Cassius, always more skeptical, sensed the tide turning sooner, understanding that power rarely rests in ideals alone but in narrative, in who controls the story that people choose to believe. And so they gathered allies and left Rome not as fugitives in their own minds, but as guardians preparing to restore balance, though the act of leaving itself marked the beginning of their decline. Because absence allows others to redefine events, and far away in the east, they assembled armies beneath skies that seemed wider than those above Rome, convincing themselves that the Republic still lived wherever they stood. While back in the capital, a young man named Octavian quietly reshaped the future, underestimated because of his age, yet guided by patience and calculation. And he adopted Caesar's legacy not with loud declarations, but with steady positioning, aligning with Antony and others when necessary, separating when useful, learning that Rome responded not just to strength, but to stability, and as alliances formed and dissolved, the conspirators realized too late that their single decisive act had not restored old traditions, but unleashed forces that demanded resolution through conflict. And at Philippi, the armies faced each other beneath skies heavy with expectation. Soldiers on both sides believing themselves defenders of Rome, though their visions of Rome were no longer compatible. And Cassius, watching the field through uncertainty and misinterpreting the flow of events, made a choice shaped by misjudgment and exhaustion, ending his path not in triumph, but in silence. And when word reached Brutus, it struck him like a philosophical paradox made real, because the man who doubted everything had acted with irreversible certainty, and Brutus continued the struggle not purely out of hope, but because retreat felt like betrayal of the principles that had guided him this far. Yet even as he fought, the sense grew that history had already chosen a direction, and defeat came gradually rather than suddenly, like a tide rising unnoticed until escape becomes impossible. And in a quiet moment, away from the noise of battle, he reflected not only on Caesar, but on the idea of power itself, questioning whether the Republic had been a memory rather than a reality, something people admired in theory but abandoned whenever crisis demanded decisive leadership. And across the empire, other conspirators faced their own endings. Some hunted through official lists that transformed politics into bureaucracy, others fading into obscurity as influence vanished, proving that Rome's revenge was rarely theatrical but deeply structural, reshaping the world so completely that the conspirators' vision could no longer survive, and Octavian watched and waited, mastering the art of appearing modest while accumulating authority, presenting himself not as king but as restorer of peace. And Rome, weary from uncertainty, accepted stability even when it meant transformation. And slowly the Republic dissolved into something new without dramatic announcement, as if the city itself had decided that chaos was more frightening than concentrated power. And years later, statues rose and narratives solidified, turning Caesar into myth and the conspirators into cautionary tales, remembered less for their intentions than for the consequences that followed. And Rome moved forward as it always did, absorbing tragedy into legend, teaching future generations that revolutions often create the very outcomes they seek to prevent. And the echo of the Ides of March lingered not because of the act itself, but because it revealed something universal about human nature, that power does not vanish when challenged, but adapts, evolves, and returns in new forms, leaving behind questions that never fully resolve, questions about loyalty, ambition, fear, and the unpredictable force of collective memory. And in the end, Rome's revenge was not delivered by individuals, but by time itself, by the gradual unfolding of events that ensured none of those who believed they were saving the Republic would live to see the world they imagined restored. And the city that once feared kings embraced an emperor, proving that history rarely moves in straight lines, but in spirals that transform ideals into realities no one expected when the first decision was made. And somewhere within that endless movement, the figures of Brutus, Cassius, and their allies became shadows walking beside the legend of Caesar, forever tied to a single moment when they believed they could control the future, only to discover that the future had already begun to change them instead.